Welcome back to Think for Christ, everybody. We are recording this episode just a handful of days after what has turned out to be a historic presidential election in the United States. It has been quite a week, and since we are on the heels of a presidential election season, we thought that it would be fitting and prudent to step back from this socio-political cultural moment to consider the thought of a man who lived in the very place and near to the very time in which democracy itself was born. Of course, that place and time was classical Greece, and that man is the philosopher Plato. Perhaps in what is his most famous dialogue, The Republic, Plato has some penetrating insights into the nature and purpose of governments in general, and he has some sobering warnings for democracies in particular. So today, we'd like to share with you some of what he has to say about democracy and why we think that what he has to say needs to be heard by every person living in a modern democracy today. Now, just by way of disclaimer, Andrew and I planned on doing this episode weeks ago, and prior to knowing the results of this presidential election, our concerns about the state of American democracy run deep, and they exist regardless of who happens to be president or which political party happens to control Congress. Nevertheless, I think that I can speak for both of us when I say that had the election gone the other way, our concerns about American democracy today would be perhaps slightly more urgent. All right, so we're going to focus on Plato's thoughts and his warnings about democracy in particular. But first, we need to say something about the Republic in general. So, Andrew, why don't you set the stage here by just giving us a brief synopsis of what's going on in this dialogue?
All righty. Now, you've asked me some wonderfully difficult questions on this channel for a few episodes now, and this might be the most difficult. How do you summarize all of the Republic in a few brief notions? I would say the easiest way to summarize the Republic is to capture the central theme that the entirety of the book is built around. And that theme is the concept of justice. The word in Greek is dikaiosune. And if, excuse me, this channel is Think for Christ. And so our audience here is hopefully as well going to be plenty of believers that'll show up as well as non-believers. But the believers in the audience will hopefully find the word dikaiosune particularly important, because while Plato builds his notion of the embodiment of justice in the city around this, and again, this notion of justice, dikaiosune, in the New Testament, it's the exact same word that gets attributed to Christ, the embodiment of dikaiosune. And so there's a sense in which the New Testament can even be drawn into this conversation pretty easily, because both, in a way, are built around this notion of dikaiosune, justice or righteousness. But Plato's asking the central question: can dikaiosune, can justice be embodied in the world? And if it can, how? And so the question actually turns on, can it be embodied in an individual? That's what he asks first. But then he notes that there's just no such thing as an individual found on their own, right? Like there's no such thing as just this individual who is just apart from everybody else. In fact, the individual is just within a political system. And so then the question is, all right, well, is it possible for the individual to embody justice? And therefore, is it also possible for a city to be found wherein it is possible for that person to embody justice? And so the question turns on, how in the world do we embody this? And for Plato, unfortunately today, he gets criticized pretty severely for being a rather authoritarian kind of, maybe not dictatorial, but he's very much an authoritarian kind of figure, at least the way a lot of people treat him. If you've read The Open Society and Its Enemies by Karl Popper, that's sort of the main reading that shapes how a lot of political thinkers approach him today. That one just depicts him as being the godfather of all the totalitarian dictatorships of the modern age, which is a horrible reading in many ways. Because what we have to keep in mind here is that when you meet a well-ordered person, a person who has their life together, the very central characteristic of that person is that they are disciplined, right? that person, in being well ordered, maintains a strong, rigorous lifestyle wherein, maybe fitness will be a high priority, but as much as anything, the life of the mind will be a high priority. They will keep themselves in check. They'll know when to hold their tongue, things like that. And if you start looking at the individual that way, and you note that the individual therefore lets their reason override their passions, what starts to sort of be embodied in the individual looks a lot like what you might call an authoritarian system, wherein the mind lords over the passions. It keeps them in check, right? And so if we approach the Republic through that lens, the lens of, well, you have to sort of be an authoritarian within yourself, right? You have to have the mind lord over the passions, and the passions never get the better of the mind. Then you can kind of see why Plato's Republic would end up looking like this, right? Would end up sort of garnering that type of criticism. But here's the other thing. What does it say about the present age, wherein we hear about a well-ordered person who rigorously maintains, in a disciplinarian sense, a well-ordered form of life? When we hear that today, we just say, ooh, that sounds terrible, right? That sounds like the ultimate evil, totalitarianism today, right? I think that kind of tells you as much as anything of what you need to know about where we find ourselves in the present age.
I just want to reemphasize something that you just said. It's very important that there are some interpretive difficulties, interpretive concerns when you come to the Republic. And some people have, I think, interpreted the Republic too literalistically. And they've walked away thinking that Plato himself is a kind of tyrant. Yeah. So there are some spooky elements in the Republic, right? When you read the Republic, I think you're shocked by some of the radical social engineering that Socrates is talking about, and that we as Americans, and especially as Christians, should find disturbing. But it's important to understand what you said. What he's probably not doing here is offering a system of government and a system of order for society for the purpose of like a realistic, practical implication. I think his vision of the ideal state is used to illustrate the notion of justice as it's related to goodness, justice as it's related to right order or righteous order. And so Socrates at the beginning of the Republic makes it very clear, hey, really what we want to talk about is justice in the soul. That's really what we want to talk about. So he says, let's try this. Let's talk about justice writ large first, justice as it exists in a society. Let's look at that. Let's get an idealized picture of what an ordered society would look like. And then from there, let's go back to the question of justice in the soul. I think that is what's happening in the Republic. I mean, it sounds like you would agree with that.
100%. And I mentioned in our own personal conversations, Plato's seventh letter, for example. And in the seventh letter, he even expresses doubt as to whether or not he thinks this ever even could be embodied. There's that famous clip from Milton Friedman where he's talking to, I'm forgetting the interviewer, but the interviewer is kind of saying, well, socialism looks like this great system, wherein, you've got these just very rigid, hierarchical sort of authoritarian leaders just having a control economy, imposing a control economy. And Milton Friedman says, where are you going to find these angels who are going to do this, who are going to actually maintain this system? Because the fact is, there aren't these angels. They don't exist. There's no human being that can do this. And I think there's a sense in which Plato himself recognizes, where are you going to find these angels? Because the people, he's advocating for what he would call an aristocracy, and he calls that several times. And so the aristocratic kind of notion that he has in mind is that the well-ordered system is one wherein there are three orders, right? At the very top, there's what's called the philosopher king. And the philosopher king is the individual who, in a way, is sort of separated out from society. And in fact, it's not that he's a king in the sense that he commands all this lavish wealth unto himself, but rather he's kind of a weird king in the sense that his needs are taken care of by the rest of the society, but they don't give him enough to give him wealth. They give him just enough to keep him alive, essentially. And this is a notion that Socrates first introduces, and he's like, wouldn't it be great if everybody had just enough to keep them alive, right? Just enough to keep them in still functioning. And Glaucon, one of the people with whom he is discussing this whole notion, says that would just be a city of pigs. What are you talking about? All right. And so that's not the ultimate conclusion, but Socrates keeps going back to this, that what needs to be kept in check is desire, essentially. And desire if it's not kept in check, sort of the passions, if they're not kept in check, will progressively start ruling the individual. If you're familiar with Plato's other works, he has this, in one of his dialogues, he has this discussion of, I think it's the Phaedrus, he has this discussion of the chariot analogy, wherein you have this charioteer who has one horse that's kind of just unruly and ugly and so forth, and it's driving all over the place. But if it's the weaker horse, then it will follow the well-ordered horse, the strong and powerful horse, in guiding the chariot where it needs to go and following the instructions of the charioteer. Charioteer here being sort of like the reason. Now, the point being, though, is that passion is not a bad thing. It's not that that should be understood that way. It's just to say, because, we function based off of desire. But the fact is, you are not free if you follow your desires, if your desires govern you, right? And so one of the themes that shows up again and again, and particularly in sort of the chronicling of the descent from aristocracy into the other forms of governance, is that people progressively give themselves over to desire. And you could almost say that there's an axiom here that is something to the effect of like, he who is led by his desires follows he who controls what is desired, right? That's the thing. It's not freedom. It's actually a kind of slavery. And that's what Socrates is getting at.
That's right.
Yeah. And so the alternative would be he who is led by wisdom is led by what is free, right? Or he himself would be free, right? And so the fact of the matter is, Plato's not sure if this can ever be embodied. And so, in a sense, you could ask him where you're going to find these little angels, and he's going to be like,
Socrates actually says that in the dialogue. He says, look, I don't know if this is at all practical. And he's really not even concerned whether or not this is practical, because what he has to say is simply an idealization of a perfectly just society that would be led by, as you said, angels rather than men at the end of the day. Yeah. But I think he's perfectly aware that that doesn't exist. So that's good to keep in mind.
Yeah, and it's important too, because the alternative is to say, all right, so if we say that justice is an illusion, right? Like it cannot exist in any sense in the city, then the question is, from where do our laws come? All right, from where do our laws arise? And there's one central figure who he shows up in the beginning of the book, Thrasymachus, and by the end of the book, he sort of becomes friends with Socrates. But in the beginning of the book, he shows up and he's right out the gate just starts hurling invectives and ad hominems, basically like, Socrates, you're an idiot, right? He just shows up and starts attacking him that way. And he proposes what is one of, I think, the most relevant definitions of justice, at least for our time, and that is that justice is in the interest of the powerful. And Socrates somewhat quickly and maybe overly quickly refutes him for the text, because in a sense, this definition that Thrasymachus gives has been the one definition that has dogged the possibility of a sort of transcendent justice governing society ever since, right? Well, I say ever since. It was probably dogging it beforehand too, but it definitely has been ever since. The thing is, with Thrasymachus, he shows up and he defines it this way. And if we take him a little bit more seriously than the dialogue does in the earlier parts, because he shows up, he says this, Socrates quickly refutes him and says, yeah, but the powerful can actually make decisions that cut against their rulings. They can unintentionally subvert themselves because they can make foolish decisions, and therefore this can be turned against itself. Like, the fact of the matter is, he kind of gets rid of Thrasymachus fairly quickly, but the objection doesn't go away very quickly.
I think that what happens at the beginning of the Republic is a little bit more sinister. I think Thrasymachus actually offers a definition of justice that is completely relativized. And in so doing, he denies that there is any such thing as justice, that there is any such meaning of the word justice, objective meaning of the word justice, because he defines it as, quote, he says, justice is nothing else than the interest of the stronger. That's what he says. That's what justice is. So in a sense, I read the Republic as this is Plato's response to the sophists. This is Plato's response to the common idea in his time and in our time that there is no fact of the matter when it comes to the idea of justice, that it's just up to whoever's in power makes the rules and gets to define what justice means. And I think what Plato's doing through the voice of Socrates is he's trying to show that there is an objective, absolute meaning to the word justice and to the idea of justice. And what he ends up showing in this republic is that justice is a virtue. It's a virtue that's related to goodness. And it's to be understood in terms of a right, a good, and proper order that's in accord with the highest good. Right? That's essentially, I think, what he's defining justice as in the Republic. And he says, all right, if this is what justice is, how do we apply this to the soul? How do we have this idea of justice in terms of right, good, proper order in accord with the highest good? How do we apply this to the soul? Well, let's step back. Let's apply it to a city first. Let's see what right order, proper order looks like in an idealized city. Not a city in the term, well, he's thinking of a city-state, first of all. He's not thinking of our modern nation-state. He's thinking of a city-state back in classical Greece. But he's not saying, let's consider people as they are, and then create some kind of a government that is most practical to that end. But he's saying, let's look at this in idealized form. Let's just pretend that men are angels, or that some men can be angels, and go from there. So I think this is what he's doing. I didn't mean to knock you off. You were about to lead us down the path and talking about what Plato sees as the 5 different forms of government. But I just wanted to make sure that we step back and first of all clarify that, there's a lot of weird, spooky stuff going on in the Republic, but I don't think it's meant to be taken literally. And secondly, what he's really after is this kind of objective, absolute understanding of justice, right? And so this is the framework. This is the background that we need to approach the Republic from, and that we need to interpret what Plato says about various forms of government in the light of this pursuit of the idea of justice. Would that be fair to say?
Oh, absolutely. It's such a great point. And it's I think, particularly relevant in this process of the degradation of society from this idealized aristocracy, which, I think increasingly as the elections go on, we see the wisdom of what Plato's getting ready to say play out, because what he is doing here is providing a reading of human nature, right? And so to your point, it not only are we asking the question of, is it possible for there to be some transcendent good, right, as opposed to just a multiplicity of goods, which is a notion which very quickly dissolves into, well, there is no such thing as good. It's just good. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, just as justice is in the eye of the one who has power, right? It's the point here is that human nature itself is laid bare by what he is outlining, by this sort of degradation from this aristocracy. And we all think today, wouldn't it be great if we just had good people ruling us, right? And so if you have ever thought that, then you are starting where Socrates wants you to start, right? Would it not be great if there were good people governing us? And if there are good people governing us, well, shouldn't there be a good that they're following after, that they're seeking?
That's great. Yeah, and we could talk about what Plato thinks about government in relation to some transcendent source of goodness, because that also comes up. There are so many good themes in the Republic. So let's go ahead and talk about the 5 kinds of government that Plato outlines in the Republic.
Okay. Yeah. So the first of them is the aristocracy, which is what he himself is looking for. And in this one, these governing officials are ordering themselves and all of their policies toward the good, a transcendent notion that's universally applicable to all men in all times. And it's one that is not mediated by or governed by self-interest. That's the important part of it being transcendent. If it's transcendent, then it's not, the whole cynical worry that I'm actually being duped into following the conniving teachings of somebody else to really just be their slave, right? At the end of the day, that gets done away with, right? That you have governing officials who are these little angels who vote for things that are good for the city. We all wish we had that. And what occurs afterwards is that people start to lose grasp of the good, right? There's a breakdown in education. And this breakdown in education it's something that I think, well, speaking of somebody that works in the education system, right? Like, it's something that is a group effort. We collectively lose sight of the good, and we start to withdraw within ourselves. But that withdrawal within the self has this sort of metaphysical function in relation to the good. No longer am I looking at the good, but I'm looking at the good as mediated by my own self-interest. And so here, when it's mediated by my own self-interest, it's redirected away from me in this sort of in this ontological hierarchy. It would be that there's the good which is above me, and then there are the material goods which participate in the good which are below me, right? And instead of looking to the good which is above me, this mediating sort of sense of the good from the self starts looking below me at the many different things which participate in the good, but which are not themselves the good. And so the shift is, we could say that instead of the good, we start talking about goods, plural, right? And so what occurs here is that now we have the individual now looking to all the multiplicity of goods, and first we measure them by honor. Right? In a democracy, we measure them by honor. And so from the aristocracy, which just looks at the good which is above us, we have now moved to the good as mediated by us, which is now first measured in honor, because we don't just immediately jump to our basest desires, right? And from there, the problem is Plato tells this story, and it's very, very realistic. You can see it happening easily. And in fact, if you read Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, he has this famous remark in Book 3 where he says that, well, actually, I've got it right here. Where's the line is that in peace and prosperity, states and individuals have better sentiments because they do not find themselves suddenly confronted with imperious necessities. But war takes away the easy supply of daily wants, and so provides a rough master that brings most men's characters to the level of their fortunes. Right? And so Plato then imagines, let's say you've got this guy who wants honor and who does value honor, and then that happens to him. War ruins his family name, or maybe his father just has a bad day in the stock market and loses everything, right? And so what occurs very quickly is that he learns that you can be honorable all day long, but honor doesn't buy bread, right? Honor doesn't keep the belly full. And so what started as a withdrawal into the self to acquire honor now starts being like, well, yeah, really what matters the most is that I acquire wealth so that I can live comfortably. And so that love of honor shifts to a love of wealth by practical necessity. And there's again, it's not to say that wealth is per se bad, but now wealth is a sort of even lesser material good that we're seeking after. And so we're sort of following down the rabbit hole of material necessities or material demands upon us, that we're pursuing lesser and lesser goods. And what occurs then is that an oligarchy falls out of this democracy. And an oligarchy follows because that locus of value has shifted now from honor to wealth. And wealth, of course, has never been evenly distributed and never will be evenly distributed, no matter how much certain political ideologues try to tell us that it could be, right? It never will be evenly distributed. And so what will necessarily occur is that when we shift over to a society where the governing value, the inner logos that structures it, is now wealth, is that there will be people, if power is equated to wealth, if governing authority is equated to wealth, then there will be people who have all the money or most of the money, and there will be people who don't. There's the haves and the have-nots. We've now entered into that game, right? This is one that's very familiar to political rhetoric to us today. Unfortunately, the struggle over honor is not very common to us today, but the struggle over wealth is. And so the problem of an oligarchy is just simply going to be that wealth is not a good thing around which to build a society. He makes the comment at one point that how is the society even supposed to defend itself? Because most of the people are going to feel disenfranchised because they don't have wealth. And if you arm them to fight an external enemy, well, the problem is you armed them and then they'll turn on you, right? So the goal of the oligarchs will be to disarm the people. Interesting. Seems like I've heard that conversation pop up in a contemporary society. But anyway, the point is, though, that this oligarchy will want the civilian populace to be disarmed, because if they have arms, they could use those arms to overthrow the oligarchy and take that wealth for themselves. And in fact, as Socrates then says, the next form of governance that falls out of an oligarchy will be a democracy, precisely because the people will overthrow and depose the sort of it's not a dictator, but the sort of dictators of the wealthy elites in the oligarchy. And so when that occurs, what Plato's describing here, when we think of democracy, we think of, again, it's the vote of the many. And we also many times will think of the Athenian democracy. And I do think that Plato, to some degree, has the Athenian democracy in mind here. but I think we need to be a little bit more cautious before we jump right into saying he's critiquing his own society. Precisely because the Athenian democracy did not function very much like what he's describing. What he describes here looks a whole lot more like anarchy. In fact, at one point, he even uses the word anarchy to describe it. And if you turn to, for example, the history of socialism, for example, the socialism was always a democratic ideal. It's not the democratic ideal, but it's a take on democracy. And if you go back to the 19th century, we've been talking about Kierkegaard in several episodes, right? And so with Kierkegaard's time, he dealt with a whole lot of socialists. But socialism at that point meant nothing more than this. Everyone in the society, regardless of race, ethnicity, class, whatever you want to say, everyone gets a vote if you are a member of that society. And so that's really what the socialists had in mind by socialism back in like the early 19th century. And so in Plato's Republic here, democracy looks a whole lot more like that. Everybody governs themselves, essentially. But for those of you who are familiar with the Bible, you know that in Judges, there's that wonderful line, in those days there was no king and every man did what was right in his own eyes. And what follows, that passage opens the book and it closes the book. And in between, you have the bloodiest book in the Bible.
Yeah, yeah. So if I can just say, when I read this section of the Republic, I think what we can certainly say is that Plato does not have, when he's thinking of democracy, he's talking more about a democracy where it's just pure majority rule, just kind of this anarchic system. He's not thinking of, this would be anachronistic for him, he's not thinking of like modern liberal democracies. He's not thinking about like American democracy that has admittedly elements that make it far superior to, I think, what Plato's outlining when he's using the word democracy. Because of course we know in modern liberal democracies, it's not just self-government through like majority rule. These are not just pure democracies. We have other elements in place that make them more stable and just, such as the rule of law, the separation of powers, checks and balances, periodic elections, and so forth. So American democracy is far from the kind of pure democracy that Plato's talking about here. In fact, we're a democratic republic, right? We're not a pure democracy. So would you say that's fair? I think when I'm reading Plato here, the target here, some people think when he says democracy, they immediately think modern liberal democracy with all of its checks and balances. But that is not, as you're pointing out, this is a more crude form of democracy that Plato is targeting here.
I would 100% agree. And that's kind of why I wanted to stress that he's not understanding these in any kind of contemporarily relevant structural sense of the governance. He's looking at the animating principle. And can we isolate this animating principle?
Great point.
And understand the political system through that principle? And so in a sense, you could say there never has been a democracy in that regard. And like you said, though, we're in a Republican democracy anyway. We're certainly not an instance. A liberal democracy is not an instance of a pure democracy in what he's talking about. For that matter, by the way, we would today look a whole lot more like what he's describing as an oligarchy than what's, in fact, even in the Republic, he refers to Athens at that time, which was structurally a democracy. He refers to it as an oligarchy. And you can see that pretty easily with the rule of somebody like Pericles just before Plato, right? That Pericles kind of functioned a lot more like an oligarch than he did like, as a purely democratic figure.
That's a good point. That's a good point. And I would just say, again, as a disclaimer, just because Plato's not targeting American democracy in particular or modern liberal democracies doesn't mean that he's not going to have some very serious warnings for American democracy and Americans who are living in a modern liberal democracy, as we will see.
And 100%, because the medieval principle that I love to stress again and again and again is that form follows telos, which is a sort of technical way to say that what a thing is determined by what it is to be, right? The nature of a knife is ordered to the task of cutting, right? And so if you are trying to cut something, you're not going to make it look like this, right? You're going to make it look like a knife with a sharp edge and so forth. The nature of the thing follows that goal towards which it's ordered. And what Plato is critiquing here, in a sense, you could say, is the telos of each of these things. The end goal of an oligarchy is wealth acquisition. And so there will be those disparities that end up emerging. And
or another way to say it maybe is the greatest good.
Yeah.
The chief greatest good that's represented by each of these forms of government.
Exactly. And so in a democracy, it's this impossible notion of equality, right? And the danger here, especially if we're keeping in mind the degradation of valuation that's occurring, that remember when we shifted from an aristocracy to a democracy, right? You had this shift from a pursuit of the transcendent good to a sense of the good as mediated by the self, right? By me. And now we're all the way to a democracy wherein that transcendent notion of the good has been replaced by everybody determines for themselves the notion of the good that they are to pursue, right? That relativization in the shift from an ideal form of governance to a democracy, an aristocracy to a democracy, still maintained some sense of a unified sense of the good, honor, right? But by now we have degraded all the way to the point where everyone just determines for themselves the form of life that they want to live as the good. And he says, doesn't this sound great? And in fact, everybody will say that it sounds great. And he gives the example of women going out and picking fashion, basically, like making fashion choices. And he says that it'll essentially, it sounds great in the same way that going shopping sounds great. And don't you just love crafting yourself in this way? But the problem is it's not a coherent and sustainable idea because there's no more a governing logos, right? There's no more a governing central good or feature that's to unify people, but rather every person is disunified, seeking their own good, and they're governed by a principle that is paradoxically, you could say that we are unified in our disunity. That's essentially what the point is.
And he says it's like, he uses the analogy, he says it's like a multicolored garment.
Yep.
Pretty to the eyes, but completely disunified.
And I think that right there, putting his finger on the pulse of that, right, like on the pulse of democracy in that, is how he then transcends his situation to then comment completely to ours, right? He is completely in lockstep with what's occurring because we can see that sort of degradation of the good, that sort of degradation of the things that we value across time. We're the same human beings now as we were all the way back then. Nothing has changed in that regard, and so we function in the same ways. And so I've been keeping a running tally. I won't quote all of them for you here, but there's two authors in particular I want to quote here, analyzing what they see is going on in our time, and they say essentially the same thing. And what they're pointing to is essentially what Plato was pointing to here. And so the first one is Theodore Dalrymple, and he's a really great British author who he's really just an essayist. And he writes in a book from 2010 called The New Vichy Syndrome. He writes that choice as a good in itself, even as the only good in itself, is now almost an unthinking orthodoxy in the West and affects everything from economic policy to medical ethics. Life is conceived as a vast supermarket through which one moves with one shopping trolley, fetching down ways of life from shelves marked existential choices. And he says then that choice becomes the measure of all things. That looks kind of like, this self-creating democratic ideal. Well, there's another guy who I've somewhat recently started reading, and he's fantastic. He's actually a Plato scholar from, where is he from? From Poland, I believe. And his name is Ryszard Legutko, and he wrote a couple of really good books. One is called The Cunning of Freedom, which is what I'll be quoting from here. But the other one is called The Demon in Democracy. Or actually, it's called, what is it? It's called... The Totalitarian Temptations in Free Societies. Really great book. But what he says here is essentially the same point that Theodore Dalrymple was making. He says, and I quote, metaphorically speaking, one could say that such a society resembles a department store in which everything is offered. Everyone can find what they want. No one feels underserved. One can change one's preferences, and even the most selective desires can be satisfied. We visualize libertarian society as an even larger space, so large that it can provide all groups and individuals with their own territories in which each can do what they want, while government's role is to ensure that those territorial borders are respected. Or, to use a different picture, we can imagine a libertarian society as a gigantic department store wherein people can move freely through every conceivable department, whatever they want, in pursuit of the goods they wish to have. It's amazing to me that it's the same metaphor that basically shows up in both of them. And he points out, Legutko points out, and Dalrymple does as well, Legutko points out that, quote, laws, culture, education, customs, traditions, and many other areas cannot be turned into separate departments, as in a large store. The problem is that we're talking about to use a sort of technical economic term, we could say that we're talking about exogenous versus endogenous factors. So if you're building a model, the exogenous factors are the factors that frame the model, right? The endogenous ones are what is determined within the model. So if you're going to talk about like equilibrium pricing, for example, in a free economy, right? You have the factors on the sides that sort of that give it the inputs, and equilibrium is going to be the intersection of those inputs. And so equilibrium is relative to whatever the measurements are on the. This is too complicated of an example, probably. But the point is the framing features are not the same as the features within the model, right? You could say that the walls of the house are not the same as the interior of the house, right? That whatever the house is going to look like, however you're going to decorate it, is relative to the framing of the house. How about that? So the exogenous factors are the framing. And the point here is, though, that if the exogenous factors govern what occurs in the endogenous factors, then you cannot make those relative, right? You cannot make law relative to the individual if everybody's supposed to follow law, right? You can't have this sort of meta law of everybody gets to do whatever they want and then call it law. It's no longer law. No one is governed by this anymore. And so the point that he's making is that laws and cultures and education and customs and traditions, these aren't the sort of things that you can actually leave up to whim. Right? These aren't the sort of things that you can conceivably hold as having any sort of relevant meaning if they're things that we can just sort of walk down and shop for. I prefer my democracy to look this way today. I prefer my democracy to look that way today. I prefer to be able to do this today instead of that, right? Because he also makes the point that, well, historically we look to something like, for example, religion to shape our values, or we look even to price to shape our values. We look to, but what happens if you have, for example, a Christian society and a Muslim society and a Jewish society all under the same roof, right? If the laws form out of the culture, and there are three different cultures clashing here at the same time, right? What you need to do is have one common set of laws, which will then relativize all the three different religious positions to order them to this hierarchical kind of law, right? So the point being, these religions won't look the same if they're supposed to all play the same in the same playground, right? And so there's something that's going to change all of these. And so the exogenous factors cannot be allowed or cannot be relativized. And that's what we find in democracy. In democracy, the framing rules that govern our behaviors have been relativized to us. And so the biggest problem here, to sort of bring all of this back to a little bit more of a intuitive notion, the biggest problem here is that what you're following now is a good which is completely mediated by your desire, which is to say a good which is nothing more than your desire. Whatever your desire wants in the moment, that is what the good is. No longer are you looking for a transcendent good, you are looking for the basest of goods. And that brings us back to the point that I opened with, which is to say that the person that controls the things that you desire controls you. You are not free. You are now the most of slave that you've ever been. And you can even see this. I've talked to a number of people actually, I can't even tell you how many people I've talked to. When people learn that you have a PhD in philosophy, they want to start bringing their existential questions to you pretty frequently. And a recurring theme again and again and again that I find is that people are struggling with addictions and with bad patterns of behavior. And these addictions and bad patterns of behavior essentially find this one line that recurs no matter who I'm talking to. And that is, I don't think I have the strength to overcome this. Right? I just don't think I have the strength to fight this. And that's because these people have spent their entire lives ordering their lives around what they desire. Right? The habit has formed to where virtue is seeking what I desire. Maybe you have some light framing on it. It'll prevent you from going all the way into whatever kind of decadent behaviors. Right? But the fact of the matter is they've conditioned themselves by habit to pursue what they desire. And now their desires are becoming vicious and they don't know what to do and they don't know how to curb them because they've never even tried to curb them. And so in a democracy, frictions will inevitably occur because people's desires are not coherent. They're not rational. They're not even necessarily good. In fact, most of the time, unbridled desire just simply isn't good. And so conflict will arise, frictions will arise, and inevitably, the person who controls the locus of desires will rise to the top and say, all right, give me all your power, or give me all the power. And that person will seize the power, and now democracy collapses into a tyranny. And there's a guy, there's a Russian philosopher. He's pretty controversial today, precisely because he's Russian. But his name is Alexander Dugin. His newest book right there is Politica Eterna, and he talks a lot about Plato's Republic here. And in fact, much of the book is a meditation on Plato's Republic. And what he ultimately says, I think one of the things that he makes, the points that he makes, is really, really profound here. And he says that by the time you get to the tyrant, what you see is the complete parody of the philosopher king. That what we're moving from is really into a society that progressively parodies in every way the idealized society. You could say that it's a world completely turned upside down. And so the tyrant, whereas the philosopher king is ruled by wisdom, the tyrant is ruled by self-interest and passion, basically. Wherein the society before is ordered by a unifying principle. Now, the unifying principle does not exist. And because the people cannot be unified, they require some guy to force unity on them in the name of freedom. Right? Like all of these things just become completely warped and contorted to be the parody on the one end of what the idealized society is on the other.
Yeah, great. This just great. Thanks for that. So let me just see if I can do a recap here and a quick overview. So in this idealized consideration of forms of political structures, Plato's going to lay out five basic forms for his purposes in the Republic. There's an aristocracy, a timocracy, an oligarchy, a democracy, and a tyranny. And each one devolves into the one below. So you start out with the best and you end up with the worst. And as you said, the way we should think about these forms of government from Plato's perspective is, what is the ruling class aiming at? What good is the ruling class aiming at? What ultimate good are they trying to inculcate into society? This is how Plato evaluates these different forms of government. He doesn't evaluate them from their practical payoffs. This is not a pragmatic evaluation. He's, just as you said, he's evaluating them in terms of what is the good that they're aiming at. And as you move down, as you devolve into these various forms of government, ending with tyranny, what we see is that the good that's being aimed at, it becomes a lesser and lesser good. And so we start with aristocracy, and Plato says the philosopher king, he's aiming at the good as it exists in itself. The true good, right? And so this is the good that he's trying to use as the paradigm for a just society. And a society that's ordered according to the actual good, the true good, is a just society. That's the point, right? So when this devolves, it devolves into a democracy. This goes from people, the ruling class is no longer pointed to the true good, but they're pointed to a lesser good. And what you said is that lesser good is something like honor, right? Or power. And that's a good, but it's not the true good. And then the democracy devolves into an oligarchy, because here the ruling class is aiming at an even lesser good. It's still a good, but it's a lesser good, and that's wealth and possessions. And then we go from this good that's being aimed at by the ruling class to a democracy, where the rule of the many are seeking another good, and that's their own self-gratification, right? Their own goods, their individual goods. And finally, this opens the door wide to what Plato calls a tyranny. A tyranny is in this state of chaos where everyone's doing right in their own eyes. It opens the door. It provides the path for a single strong man to step into that chaotic situation, that what? Disorder, that injustice. And this tyrant steps in and he imposes a kind of order, doesn't he? Except it's not a virtuous order that he imposes. It's a vicious order. And so what happens? You become enslaved as a society. And now remember, what is Plato doing? He's blowing this up. He's blowing this idealization of government up so that we can examine our own souls, right? And justice in our own souls. And as you've been pointing out, as we move down these forms of government, we can think about these forms of government as the state of our soul governing itself, right? And so a person is just in their soul when what they are aiming at is the true good, right? And insofar as you begin to aim for lesser and lesser goods, you begin to become more, what? Disordered and unjust. And guess what? You lose your freedom. You lose your freedom as a person until you get to the final state, which is tyranny, where you become a slave. You become an utter slave to your own passions, to your own dispositions, to your own desires. Is that basically the picture that Plato's drawing for us here?
Yeah, amen, and well said.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So one of the distinctions, you're not going to understand the Republic unless you understand what, for Plato, he thinks is kind of the chief end of a political society, and that is the promotion of virtue and happiness, right? He thinks that a society, a political society, ought to exist to promote happiness in the classical sense, right? Of a life characterized by intellectual and moral virtues and excellence. So for Plato, he thinks that you cannot have justice. You cannot have justice in a society or in a soul, in an individual soul, apart from virtue, right? Apart from moral goodness. And by the way, this is exactly the belief of the founding fathers of the United States of America. So this may seem like a totally foreign idea to you. If you're listening to this, you've never heard of the Republic, you haven't given this much thought. But the idea that a political society should be aimed at the good and should be exist to promote justice and to promote virtue in its people, this may sound totally foreign from the perspective of our contemporary situation and period. But this is exactly how the founding fathers of the United States believed that things should go. They believed that there was a necessary connection between virtue and government and governance. And let me just give you a few quotes here. I'll put them up on the screen for anyone watching on YouTube. George Washington, he said, "Virtue or morality is a necessary spring of popular government." That's George Washington. Ben Franklin, "Only a virtuous people are capable of freedom." James Madison, "To suppose that any form of government will secure liberty or happiness without any virtue in the people is chimerical. It's imaginary. It's an imaginary idea." Thomas Jefferson says that the minds of the population have to be informed by education about what is right and wrong, to be encouraged in habits of virtue, and to be deterred from those of vice. He says these are the inculcations necessary to render the people a sure basis for the structure and order of government. Samuel Adams, "Neither the wisest constitution nor the wisest laws will secure the liberty and happiness of a people whose manners are universally corrupt. He therefore is the truest friend of liberty of his own country, who tries most to promote its virtue." Patrick Henry, "A vitiated or impure state of morals, a corrupted public conscience, is incompatible with freedom." And finally, John Adams, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." So this classic idea that we find in Plato, the main idea that we find in Plato, that justice, whether we're talking about justice in a society, in a government, or justice in the soul, is intimately tied to the good, is intimately tied to the pursuit of virtue. So this may sound totally foreign, but this is actually what was believed by those people, those men and women who founded our democracy. So it's not just an ancient idea. It's actually at the very foundation of our own country. So that should be a warning to all of us. As we see our society drifting into a state of viciousness, right? Drifting away from virtue, drifting away from righteousness, according to our own founders, not just according to Plato, but according to our own founders, we are going to lose our liberty. We're going to lose our freedom as a society, as a soul of a nation. So anyway, sorry for the rant, but I just had to connect that to the contemporary moment here.
Well, it's I think particularly relevant, especially on a channel like this, right? Because with the Christian community, there's this tendency to all too quickly dismiss pagan sources, right? And I have in mind, for example, Greg Bahnsen has a book on theonomy, wherein he waves his hand and dismisses Plato, right? He has this chapter where he says this is sort of like his review of secular political philosophy or something like that, right? And he gives like 2 paragraphs on Plato, and then he waves his hand and says, "Yeah, but nobody even follows that anymore," and moves on as if that refutes, or what is it that Plato? What is it? Something like nobody even follows that, and it's self-defeating or something along those lines. Waves his hand, dismisses it, and moves on. And I'm thinking when I was reading that, I almost wanted to just throw the book across the room, because I'm thinking, like, what do you mean here? What is no longer relevant about that notion that you are stressing right there, that the city needs to be ordered toward the highest good, right? It's only an incredibly crude. And I would also kind of cynically say that I would think that I don't trust the people who say that it's not worth reading, because there's so much wisdom in this that who still follows this? Everyone after Plato follows this on some level. The founders followed it. And the thing is, sure, you can point to bad political philosophers who follow it as well. But the point is that everyone has followed this book ever since. And it's incredibly relevant it's only actually, I would say, even grown in relevance ever since he's written it. And of course, today we live in a democracy. I almost felt like I was doing that meme. We live in a society, but we live in a democracy. And unfortunately, it's one of those terms that we throw about too casually, right? It's sort of become a good in and of itself, but we don't know what it means, right? It's sort of, unfortunately, too much of our discourse functions that way, that these terms get used and we're never particularly clear on what they mean. We just know we're supposed to affirm them. And what Plato is pointing to, as much as anything, that we should sort of take and learn from, is that democracy per se is not a good, right? Sure, tyranny is terrible, and he's not trying to argue for tyranny. Clearly, he's going in the other direction from tyranny, right? He's not trying to order us to a closed society in a tyrannical sense, the way that Karl Popper is going to say, right? But rather, he is trying to show us that the individual must be well formed. You must have well ordered passions, well ordered desires before you can actually have a functioning form of governance in any capacity. And it's such a tenuous thing to preserve. And so there's another thinker that I always like to bring into this, and his name is, of course, Thomas Sowell, one of the greatest of all time. I think he's probably the greatest American intellectual of all time. But he has this distinction between what he calls the vision of the anointed and the tragic vision. And the tragic vision essentially says, hey, when you've discovered a system of governance that actually works pretty well, like, it's a delicate, tenuous thing to preserve, and you need to work hard to preserve it. And you need to be very, very cautious about moving beyond that, about, correcting it and perfecting it, right? Because you're more likely to actually mess it up and then make it worse than you are to actually improve it, right? So you need to be very careful in doing that. However, the vision of the anointed, the contrary one, has this idea really largely rooted in this expressive individualism of the present age, wherein it's, well, no, we need to just move headlong toward this thing called democracy, this self-actualizing thing, wherein the good, as perfectly governed by my own desires, is basically just lived out to its fullest, right? We need to find better ways to accommodate that system of governance. And so people with this vision of this anointed vision say that the problems in society are pretty much things that we can rationally fix, and we just pursue them in terms of our mistaken ideas about what human nature is, about what we should become, and they just corrupt what is good. Because again, what Plato's pointing to here is, it's wrongly understood if we just see it as some call for activism or anything of the sort, right? Like, he's saying it's such a tenuous and delicate thing to ever even discover the good, that it's so easily distorted. And this system of sort of the vicious cycle of the collapse of governance illustrates that point, I think, very perfectly.
That's great. This is great. Before we close here, let me just say something about this notion of freedom that comes up in Plato's Republic. I think it's crucial. I think there's something really, really, really important that Plato has to say here. As I read the Republic, it seems to me that one of the most urgent concerns that Plato expresses about democracy is over what I call the cult of freedom. The cult of freedom. I think this comes out in several places in the Republic. So let me explain. This will take just 1 minute to unpack here. So Plato, through Socrates, warns that within a democratic society, as well as we'll see within what he calls a democratic man, there inevitably arises this, what he calls an insatiable longing for freedom. And Socrates says this leads to a kind of disorder or an injustice in both society and individual people. So freedom in this situation comes to be seen as the greatest good, right? Or as the highest attribute, as we've been talking about, in both the political society and in the souls of men. And to put this in Christian terms, Plato's telling us that in democracies, freedom tends to become an idol freedom begins to be seen as the highest good, right? An end all. Freedom becomes an end in itself, something to be pursued for its own sake, something to be worshiped. And Plato warns us that societies that value freedom above all else will inevitably end up engaging in a kind of cult of freedom. And when this happens, there is a distortion that takes place in our understanding of what freedom is, right? And ultimately, it leads to a kind of disorder, a kind of injustice within society and within the soul. So it's important to understand that for classical perennial philosophy and for the New Testament alike, freedom is defined as a state of being that's in accord with reason and virtue, right? So according to freedom as a state of being that's in accord with reason and virtue, it follows that freedom can come in degrees, right? And so the more rational, the more virtuous a person is, the freer that person is. And of course, the inverse of this will also be true. The less rational, the less virtuous a person is, the less free that person will be, according to this classical and New Testament notion of freedom. Aristotle says that to the extent that we're governed by reason and virtue, to that same extent are we living as free, rational animals, right? To be governed by the bodily appetite, to be governed by the passions, is, for Aristotle, to be less rational. It's to be less human. It's to be more animal. It's to be more beastly, right? So the same idea is expressed, I think, in different words by the Apostle Paul in the New Testament. Paul says that to live according to the flesh or according to sinful desires is to live as a slave, right? As a slave of the flesh. And the person who is really and truly free, paradoxically, according to the Apostle Paul, is the person who's a slave to righteousness, right? It's the person who's, as he says, crucified the flesh with his passions and desires. So true freedom from the Christian perspective and from the classical perspective is freedom from the flesh and freedom for virtue and righteousness. This is what freedom means for Plato, for Socrates, for Plato, for Aristotle, for the Apostle Paul, for the New Testament writers. Now, of course, this understanding of freedom is almost completely foreign to people today in our modern liberal democracies. Most people today understand freedom as freedom from restraint, right? To be free in our notion of freedom today is just to be able to do what you want, to do whatever you desire. When it comes to the modern conception of freedom, I think all the emphasis is on the act of choice, like that quote you read a little bit ago, on the willing itself, right? All the attention is on the act, on the willing. There's almost no regard for the object of the choice. It's just the act of the choice that matters, not the object of the choice, or on what it is that we're willing. So what's most important for our society, what's valued above all else in our culture, is that people be allowed to choose according to their own desires, whatever those desires may be. The moral quality, the moral value of our desires and inclinations, it's no longer what chiefly matters to us as a society. What matters most is the act of choice itself, and that act be totally unfettered and without restraint. So there is today, it's so crucial to understand this, there is today a primacy of choice, right? Choice is king. This is what happens, according to Plato, in a democratic society. The exercise of choice becomes, as you were saying, the greatest good that there is, the good that ought to be pursued above all other goods. And I would argue, just as a side note, I'm not going to make the argument here, but I would say that you can't fully appreciate today the pro-choice movement apart from this distorted conception of what freedom is. I think we're never going to understand that movement unless we understand the change that's taken place in the notion of freedom. Now, this difference, I think, between the classical and the biblical idea of freedom on the one hand and the modern idea of freedom on the other, it's captured nicely by the philosopher, I always get his name wrong, I think it's Survey Pinkiers, who he was a philosopher, Catholic philosopher. He called the classical view the freedom for excellence, and he called the modern view the freedom of indifference. And freedom for excellence is just what I've been saying. It's the idea that man is ordered toward an objective good. This is Plato's idea. And that the purpose or goal of the human life is to align oneself with the objective good through the cultivation of moral and intellectual habits and virtues. And to the degree that we're able to align ourselves with the good, the objective good, to that same degree will we be free. And when we consistently choose lesser goods, this leads to the acquisition of bad habits and vices, which in turn leads to a loss of self-mastery, a loss of self-possession, a loss of self-control, which is a kind of tyranny, which is a kind of slavery. And then the freedom of indifference, which is the freedom that is, this is the way we define freedom today, freedom of indifference. This is the idea that freedom is simply the power to choose, right? The power to choose between two contraries. So freedom's no longer tied to the notion of the good or to virtue or to righteousness or to happiness understood as right living. The object, as I said, of choice drops out entirely, and it's only the choice that remains. So freedom of indifference is a freedom without any purpose. It's a freedom without any direction. It's a freedom without any goal. And because it's not pointed towards the good, because it's not pointed towards virtue, it inevitably leads to vice and a kind of slavery. Okay, let me land the plane here. So if we go back to the Republic with this distinction between the true classical idea of freedom on the one hand over against this distorted modern view of freedom on the other hand, it will help us to see, I think, why Plato thinks that democracy can so easily lead to tyranny, both in the state and, more importantly, in the soul. In the Republic, Plato, again through Socrates, says that democracies devolve into tyrannies according to, as we've seen, a certain pattern, right? First, both the ruling class and the people give themselves over to lesser goods, baser desires and passions. And this
extravagance.
Yeah, that's right. Extravagance. Yeah. This then leads to a society, as you said, that's in a state of anarchy, right? And this state of anarchy in society then opens the door to a strong man who seizes upon this state of disorder and then imposes his own order upon it, and then the people become enslaved, and you end up with tyranny. Now remember, this is the point. I think this is, I don't want to say the central message of the Republic, but this is one of the central messages of the Republic. Remember that Plato is ultimately concerned here with justice as it exists in the soul. And the political society is supposed to provide an analogy of justice in the soul. So what goes for the democratic state goes for the democratic man, right? When a person gives himself over to his basest desires and passions, extravagances, this leads his soul into a state of disorder, into a state of anarchy or injustice, right? And ultimately to a kind of tyranny in which a person becomes enslaved to his basest appetites, inclinations, and passions. And in this case, it's a person's vices that becomes the tyrant and which enslaves the soul. So paradoxically then, the soul that values freedom of choice over all else ends up becoming a slave to the tyranny of its own vices. It becomes a disordered soul, an unjust soul. This, if I may say, I think is one of Plato's central themes in the Republic. And I think this is the urgent warning for us today. We live in a modern liberal democracy that has checks and balances, and as a form of government, it's pretty stable. But that doesn't mean that we can't give ourselves over to a kind of tyranny that Plato's warning about, a tyranny of the soul, right? In his own day, Plato had witnessed pure majority rule democracies devolve into tyranny. Like he saw that happen in his own day. In our democratic constitutional republic, with all of its inbuilt systems of checks and balances, I think it's much more protected from tyranny than the classical democracies of Plato's time. So from the perspective of political government, I don't think we're in the kind of danger that Plato worried about. I think the political bones of our democratic republic are still intact. Now, but although I don't think that our democracy is in danger of political tyranny at this moment, as I said, I think we're very much in danger of what I call the tyranny of the soul. As a society, we're in danger of becoming what Plato calls the democratic man, right? As a society, we've embraced the freedom of indifference. We're engaged in the cult of choice. The act of choice, wholly apart from the object of choice, has become, for our society, the greatest good. And as a result, and just as Plato predicted, we've devolved into a tyranny of sorts. We've been enslaved by our basest appetites, our inclinations, our passions. We've traded true freedom for bondage. The soul of our nation, I think, has become disordered and unjust. And if I can just end with this, consider for a moment how Socrates describes the soul of the democratic man. Okay, just listen to this. He says that the soul of the democratic man rejects the wisdom of elders and is instead deceived by seductive arguments. It says that moral shame is nothing but simple-mindedness, that self-discipline is called cowardice, moderation is called mean and parochial, insolence, Socrates says, becomes sophistication, anarchy, freedom, extravagance, generosity, and shamelessness, courage. He writes this of the democratic man, and I'm quoting now. He says, quote, putting all his pleasures on equal footing, he grants power over himself to the pleasure of the moment, as if it were a magistrate chosen by lot. And when he has had his fill of it, he surrenders himself in turn to another pleasure. He rejects none of them, but gives sustenance to all alike. If someone tells him that some pleasures are the result of fine and good desires, others of evil desires, and that he should follow and value the first, and punish and hold in subjection the second, he does not admit this truth. He shakes his head at any claims of this sort, saying that all desires are equal and must be valued equally. And so he lives out his life from day to day, gratifying the desires of the moment, end quote. Does this not describe the current state of the American soul? According to Plato and the collective wisdom of perennial philosophy, and as I said, Christianity alike, a society that gives itself over to the cult of choice is a society in chains. It's a society under the yoke of a kind of oppressive tyranny. And I'm sorry for the tirade, but that, I think, is the central message of what we've been looking at in Plato's Republic. And I think that is the urgent application that the Republic can have for us today in a modern liberal democracy.
Amen to all of that. There's a passage in Thucydides that's very similar to that one as well that you just quoted, wherein he states it so very bluntly. Basically, the same thing that you just read is stated there, except that he adds the line that when these sorts of revolutions occur, wherein the oligarchs are deposed for the democracy, he says that words change in their meanings to do exactly that which you're talking about, right? That words sort of become unanchored from their obvious meaning, such that courage, or rather recklessness, becomes courage, essentially, right? And all of those inversions that you were just citing in Plato's quote are made possible, right? That freedom, or really what is in fact slavery, becomes the definition of freedom, essentially here. And the danger, I think, for us today is, the real question is, hopefully everybody listening to this will recognize that we are in this moment, right? We are in a very democratic moment. We may not be in an anarchistic moment, but we are still in a very, we're lost in this democratic morass right now. And the question then becomes, how do you get out, right? How do you get out of it? Because if we can see very clearly that we fit the description of what Plato has outlined here, it seems like, well, the dictator's right around the corner, right? The tyrant is right around the corner, because tyranny in the self, like if we have given tyranny to our passions, well, those passions will then give that tyranny over to a person who's going to embody them. And so the question ends up being, how do you get out of that? And the medievals have, I think, a very important distinction that they draw that we as well should heed. And that is to say that there's two types of way of laws that we can follow, right? And the two types of laws are going to be one, which is, to use a sort of Hegelian vocabulary, there's going to be what's mechanically imposed, and that's going to be externally imposed upon us. And then there's the laws of virtue, which are internally fostered, right? And the fact of the matter is, mechanical repetition does not necessarily translate to an internal virtue, right? The fact that I am forced to do something does not mean that I will never. That does not mean that if that forcing power is gone, that I won't immediately do that thing, right? The fact that power is preventing me from being wicked does not mean that I won't be wicked the moment the power disappears, right? And so, unfortunately, you could say that the rational governance of a system dies in a time of pure fiat, right? And when politics reduces to a sort of power struggle when politics reduces to following our desires, we have competing desires. You have what Hobbes described as the war of all against all, right? And these competing desires, therefore, just increasingly seek to just legislate their own desire above all others, right? And so that just looks like a fiat, just declaration just out of thin air, right? That this is just the way it will be. And moral claims increasingly look that way. And political victories increasingly look that way. Now we have the power of fiat as opposed to you having the power of fiat. And these fiats are just going to be butting heads and with increasing intensity until basically the system inevitably, I think, would just turn over to the figure who embodies the fiat, the dictator. And in fact, if you look throughout history, if you look at the emergence of fascism, for example, it's another term that gets thrown around that nobody really truly knows what it means anymore. In fact, I read an article from, I think it was 1932, wherein the article opens up with the lament that this term doesn't seem to mean anything. It just seems to be a cudgel with which to beat your political opponent. And I thought that was hilarious. That's 1932, right? Like Hitler hadn't even come to power yet, right? And it's already becoming that. But the point is, what fascism, though, was sort of promoted as, and I think this is really kind of instructive because it embodies historically exactly what Plato was talking about in the movement from democracy to tyranny. Because what the fascists in Italy were saying was increasingly this. They were saying, we are not ideological because fascism is not committed to any particular set of policies. It's neither capitalist nor socialist. It's none of these things. What it is that the system is just broken. And we need somebody to come in here and just radically fix it. We need the strong man to come in and just radically fix it. And so, if it turns out, if he brings in socialistic policies and those don't work out, then don't worry about it. He'll just shift to something else. He'll just fix the broken system. And what is this if not just simply democracy giving itself over to this kind of tyranny? And the amazing thing about that is that this is only going to embody one group's fiat, right? And you see that kind of in contemporary discussions, even within Christian circles, right? Christians, particularly like the Christian nationalist discussions, they're going to be increasingly saying, well, we need control over the fiat so we can impose God's law upon the system. Well, the medievals had a different notion, right? Aquinas, for example, has a different notion. And he's going to say that mechanistic imposition, i.e. the fiat, is not capable of teaching virtue. That where virtue is to be found is not in simple brute repetition, but rather in community, which itself fosters virtue. And what you have in the church for the medievals is that community which fosters virtue. And so what you need with governance is a system that by mechanistic imposition keeps relative peace, right? It just keeps conflict from breaking out. It keeps the fiats from butting heads so violently. And what you need then as a response is then the actual community that fosters virtue, the church, which is capable of reaching the inner man and through that fostering virtue within him, demonstrating the good to him and teaching him in the good, right? What you need is in the church to come in and to do the work of proper education to build this better society. And therefore, it's if you have the church mistaking that its laws are for this just fiat, right, to govern everything, as a lot of the Christian nationalists are doing right now, right, that we just need to have everybody follow God's law here. Well, yeah, we do need everybody to follow God's law, but which of the two kinds of law is it? Is it a mechanical law to be imposed on a system? Well, that's kind of more the Pharisaic approach. Or is it this internal law, which is going to be fostered via the community of the church? And, increasingly the answer is people just want to have the power to say we need the fiat to just will our way out of it. And the problem is never going to be willed away, right? Because the will is already what is corrupt in the democratic system.
Right. And you can't impose virtue from the outside.
Exactly. And so what you need instead then is you need, again, like a sort of separation of powers. One, which is the pure goal of governance here, is to preserve the peace so that then the institution that teaches virtue can come in and do its thing. Yeah.
This has been great, man. I think that at the end of the day, maybe we can say this. Reflecting on Plato's Republic, reflecting on what he says are the dangers of democracy. There's one sense in which our society our government is not really in danger of devolving into a tyranny. We have a pretty good democracy. It's a constitutional republic where we have checks and balances and so forth. I mean, one could argue, and I'm not going to argue it here, maybe this will be the subject of another episode, that there is a tyrannical element, perhaps, in our government through the existence of this shadowy and bloated bureaucracy, what a lot of people refer to as the deep state, that functions wholly apart from the will of the people. These are unelected officials, and it seems like this unelected bureaucracy just gets more bloated and bloated. It never shrinks, right? It never shrinks. It always grows. So I think you could probably make an argument that there is a form of tyranny that we have subjected ourselves to in our political structure, right? But nevertheless, I would say, look what just happened in this past election. It looks like, from where we sit right now, it looks like Republicans may have the House, the Senate, so Congress, the presidency, and the judiciary, right? So it's hard to complain about our democratic government, right? About our system of politics right now, because there's a lot of ways in which it's working. But nevertheless, I think, as we've both been saying, I think the theme here is that there still remains an urgent warning from Plato in the Republic. And it doesn't have to do with the tyranny of government, of political society. It has to do with the tyranny of the soul of this nation, and a tyranny that exists in each of us as individuals, that we have almost entirely given ourselves over to lesser goods, that we have almost entirely given ourselves over to vices and bad habits and bad thinking and delusions and bad education, which it's just like we're in this death loop of vice. And you cannot be free. In the most important sense of the word free, you cannot be free as a society, and you cannot be free as an individual when you are living under the tyranny of your own appetite, of your own passions and desires. And to speak from the perspective of a Christian, if you want to be free as a society, you have to crucify the flesh with its passions and desires. You have to pursue the good, capital G, and you have to build good habits and virtues. So Andrew, I think we're in this weird paradoxical. I would love to know what Plato would think if he looked over the landscape of our society. And on the one hand, he sees this pretty stable, pretty good government. But on the other side, he sees this tyranny of the soul of the nation. It's just this weird paradoxical situation that I don't think can last long in the state that it's in, because ultimately I think the soul of a nation can even drag down the best of governments if that soul has become vicious and tyrannical. So anyway, there is the warning from Plato, from the grave 2,500 years ago. I think we need to take it seriously. And although many of us are rejoicing as to what happened this past week with the presidential election, I think this is a good time for prudent people, for wise people to step back and say, okay, let's rejoice in the good, but let's be very deliberate and concerned about the evil that is there and that is growing